Only one of the quarter-final matchups in the FIDE World Cup went to a tiebreak, and that was the match between Peter Svidler and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, two very experienced competitors. In some ways, no surprise that it couldn't be decided in the classical games. So the first of the 25-minute tiebreak games was a draw, with Vachier-Lagrave slightly pressing with white, but Svidler held the draw reasonably comfortably. This is the second 25-minute game, and it's an English opening, and they're playing this quite trendy line, which can lead to really wild complications. So after knight b4, black would like to play the knight into d3, of course, and if white defends against that with, say, d3, then actually white's structure isn't that great. So bishop g4 is a nice move. One could, consider playing this knight around to d4. Black would be fine there. So basically white has to play some kind of special moves. This is very well analysed opening theory, and well, played quite a lot in practice as well. Quite an old variation, actually. I remember in the 70s, Pologevsky and Tal, for example, playing this line. Bishop c4 allows knight d3 check, but you can see that black at the moment is only playing with this knight. So to avoid this marauding knight, the king has to slightly dance out of the way, and of course white can no longer castle, but black is expending so many moves here with just one knight, and you can see black's development obviously is lagging. And now white threatens the move d4, hitting the knight, well, with a massive position, so that's why the knight has to come back. But positionally, quite a nice move, because it looks at this weakened d4 square. However, there's a downside: it blocks in this bishop. Now, in this position, the most popular move for white is to sacrifice a pawn with pawn to b4. Levon Aronian has played this, for example, in quite a few games. He smashed Topalov in London 2015, a couple of years ago, with b4 and then knight d5. And, well, Maxime is very well prepared generally, so he would have been ready for this. But Svidler plays a relatively new move, h4. Now this already looks pretty bizarre. What on earth is this h-pawn doing, shooting in the dark? Well, one of the points of the move is that in this position, because the knight blocks the e-pawn, then black would like to develop his king's bishop with g6 and bishop g7. Very logical. Also looks at the d4 square, but clearly after g6, h5 is already, well, certainly justifies the advance of the h-pawn, so not a good idea. So basically black has to commit himself in the centre with knight d4 and develop the bishop another way. But now at least white is clear about what he's having to deal with here. So d3. And now in one of their classical games, they also reached this position, and Maxime played knight c6, looks very logical, to support the knight on d4. But Svidler was slightly better in the position that they reached. Well, let me just give a few more moves. You can see white's development is superior to black's, and well, you can see that white is certainly more comfortable here with some pressure against this c-pawn, although Vachier-Lagrave did succeed in holding this endgame. Anyway, a little bit uncomfortable for black. So in this game he played e6, so a very straightforward move, just ready to develop this bishop. Bishop f4, and a6 prevents any incursion from the knight. Now, white's position looks very nice. The only problem is that it's going to take some time for the king to actually, get to a decent square and straighten out white's pieces, connect the heavy pieces. So, although black is obviously behind development, it's perhaps not that bad. And also, having control of this square is quite good. Also, this bishop, which kind of looks wonderful, but actually it's just biting on the pawn on e6 for the moment. So black is okay here, basically. Svidler exchanged. Pawn takes, so that gives black a little bit of time because the white knight had to move. And now the position is, at least the pawn structure, is becoming more akin to a kind of King's Indian. You can see with these pawns here locked in the centre. King's Indian with colours reversed, of course. Which can't be too bad for black, having a little bit of space. And now you can see black is definitely catching up with development. I think bishop d6 is a good move. Svidler exchanged. And now bishop d7 from Vachier-Lagrave. So he's keeping his options open. King might stay in the middle of the board, could castle on either wing, depending on how white plays his position. Well, if white just plays to the king to g2, sort of quite modestly, just connecting the rooks, then knight e5 is quite an annoying move, hitting the bishop. Bishop goes back. Well, already you can see that d3 pawn is somewhat under fire, and occasionally the knight might be able to come to f3. So certainly an annoying move. So, well, typically white lunges forward with the f pawn, and now black has to react quite smartly here, because if white starts to roll these pawns down the board, then that knight could come into e4. That's pretty healthy. e5 from Vachier-Lagrave, excellent move. And now white has a bit of a dilemma. Do you hold the pawn on f4? Do you capture, or do you push? In a sense, a typical King's Indian question has been presented to white here. So if white holds with g3, then there's a nice square for the bishop on g4, and that knight isn't particularly well placed, so that would be pleasant for black. If white exchanges, then black has established this beautiful knight on e5, and I certainly don't like white's king in this position. Therefore, very quickly Svidler advanced. So now you can probably see the contours of a King's Indian pawn structure are more evident after this pawn advance on the king side. Now, if black just plays some normal moves here, well, for example, castles king side, then this would be a very pleasant position. You can see these pawns roll down the board in very typical fashion, and yeah, an easy position for white to play. I mean, even if black castles on the queen side, well, okay, first of all, watch out for bishop f7, but in any case, I think white has stability there once g4 and knight g3 comes, and then the king comes to g2. Seems to be fine. So Vachier-Lagrave reacted very quickly here, and this was absolutely right. He attacked white's pawn chain while the king isn't very secure. So if white tries to hold this f pawn, then h5 breaks up those pawns. So, obviously g5 impossible because this pawn drops. If pawn takes h5, well, you could either take on f5 or, I think just taking on f5 is probably very strong for black. So, yeah, a very good move, undermining white's pawn chain. And if this pawn is captured, then this opens up the h-file for the rook, and, well, black can even contemplate f5 and an attack on the king. So that's very pleasant. So, not an easy position for white. Svidler covered the pawn on f5 with the knight, but again, pressure on this pawn. And you can see that already black is gaining the initiative. It's not easy for white with this king on f1 just blocking the rooks. So Svidler has to start improvising. Queen h6. Castle's queenside. It's clear that black's king is much safer than white's here. Now if that f pawn is taken, then a rook comes to the f file, and well, at the moment there's a pin on the 6th rank, but after rook f6 suddenly there is huge pressure down the f file, and well, rook g6 also threatened here. Black is doing extremely well. So h5 from Svidler. And now the move of the game, and after the game Svidler lauded this move. King c7, excellent move, very quiet move. The point is that if white now exchanges on g6 and takes the rook, then it's no longer check. So black has a free move here to open the position, and this is already very, very difficult for white. You can see the rooks are still split. The king is starting to open up. Black's king is safe. It can always just bop round here to the queen side. And white's king is under fire. Also, the king protects the queen, so that now black is once again threatening to take on f5. And this is already a very, very difficult position for white. Svidler took on f7. G takes f5. The problem is that even these endgames are very pleasant for black. So, for example, rook c1 check, queen takes on rook takes. This is really nice. And now white's king is not in a pleasant situation. So after these moves, for example, I mean, these are more or less forced. These pawns are weak. At the moment, well, that couldn't be taken, but after king d6, now there's a threat to take here. So those kingside pawns are weak. These pawns are tremendous. The bishop isn't doing much. Well, this is just a big advantage for black. Well, Svidler chose another endgame, also very pleasant for black. So if this is exchanged off, well, in a sense it's rather similar to that last variation. That bishop is a superb piece, and black's rooks start to attack as well. Knight e4 check, so at least this knight is good, but now that is a star performer in black's army. What a piece. And this bishop, well, also superb as well, attacking the knight. So black starts to occupy this open file, and knight takes g2. Could exchange first and play knight takes g2, but well, this is very strong. So knight f4 threatened. So Svidler is in a desperate situation, and he decided to sacrifice the exchange, which at first glance didn't look too bad, because black's king is suddenly under fire, and at least this knight is secure on e4. But in fact, Maxime had it under control. He knew what he was doing. Here's the key move, rook b8. So in fact, black gets activity here. So after the check, in fact, black's king is safe here. If, let's say, bishop c4, then this counterattack is just too strong. Knight g2 and rook f1 threatened. Black is winning. Svidler tried bishop f7 to block out this rook, but after, well, rather prosaic rook b7, simply pinning and winning, Svidler had to resign. So that meant that Maxime Vachier-Lagrave won their match, and he goes through to the semi-finals. So today, Monday, is a free day in Tbilisi, and they play the semi-finals on Tuesday, first game on Tuesday. So we have the semi-finals. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave plays against Levon Aronian, and Wesley So plays against Ding Liren. So now we are at the business end of the tournament. they're playing for the real prize, which is a place in the final. And if they win this semi-final, get through to the final, then they qualify for the candidates tournament next spring.